Hello, and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On this week's episode, I'm talking to Ishi Robinson, author of the delightful novel Sweetness in the Skin. In this book, we meet the absolutely wonderful character of Pumpkin, a teenage girl trying to make her way in the world and be true to who she really is. The story is moving and wholesome while tackling some darker issues including colorism, classism, abusive and absent parents, strained family relations, and so much more. Ishi Robinson is a Jamaican writer living in Berlin. Her first published work was a short story in the national newspaper when she was just 11 years old. Since then, she's written opinion pieces and short stories of fiction for various publications in Kingston, Toronto, Rome, and Berlin. Sweetness in the Skin is her first novel, and I'm so glad she's my guest today. Hi, Ishi. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. It's so lovely to have you here. I cannot wait to talk to you about your stunning novel, Sweetness in the Skin, which is a very beautiful and bright cover. Absolutely love it. But also just a very lovely story. I say lovely, it's not all happiness and rainbows, but there's a lot about it that's like really wholesome,
Mhm.
which I absolutely love. So welcome to the show. How
Thank
are you
you
doing?
so much. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk about sweetness in the skin, and I'm enjoying 28-degree weather today in Berlin. So I'm very happy. Sunshine makes me happy. Jamaicans are solar powered, so this is my
Yes, I'm
thing.
sure. I think I'm in the UK and it's just been a very long winter. And I was telling you, just we had a spell of beautiful sunshine yesterday, but it seems to have disappeared for today. But we're hopeful. We're hopeful. But before we get into talking about your novel, I am really interested in talking about your writing journey because from just like reading like your author bio that's in the book,
Mhm.
I can see that you've been writing since you were very young, since you were a teenager. And that's not even just like writing for yourself, like you've had stuff that's gone online and gone published. And I think you wrote your father a letter and he found it hilarious and that got printed in a newspaper. So what has your writing journey been like and how did it all begin?
Yeah, I've been writing since I was way before as a teenager. I don't remember any time that I wasn't writing. Truly, I don't have a memory of not writing stories. When I was a very small kid, I think as soon as I could physically write, I was writing stories and I would give them to my parents. And so when I was 11, one of the stories I gave to my parents, my dad took it to the national newspaper in Jamaica and about unbeknownst to me, by the way. And then he turned up with it 2 weeks later, turned up with the paper with my story in there, with my name in print. I don't know if I've ever been so excited in
Oh,
my life when I was a kid. And from there, like when I saw my name in the paper, that's when I was like, oh, I want to see this more. I want more stories in more papers. And so I continued to write all through school. And again, just for my parents, just for me, just for school. And then as a teenager, when I went on my exchange year to Switzerland, as you said, I wrote him a letter, a personal, private letter back to my parents about my first few weeks. That this is in 96, so it's like the internet was in its infancy. I didn't know what that was, never heard about it. So I was
mhm.
handwriting, and then in a package that they sent me, I don't know, however many months later, he also put the newspaper column
Oh,
in there. And there's my letter with my pictures that I sent to him of me and my new friends. And the paper was like, yeah, does she have any more? And
oh,
so I started a column that way. So I had this column in the national paper. I did that for a couple of years. And then I moved back to Jamaica, and then I moved to Canada. And there I was writing not so much fiction. I've been in corporate communications actually for more than 20 years, and that involves a lot of a different type of writing, but still writing and still creatively in a way. So I was more focused on that. And then I moved to Rome, and then I started doing another column for expats in Rome, which was like a funny observations of the Italians and being a foreigner in Italy. And then when I moved to Berlin about 14 years ago, I felt like something was missing.
Mm.
And I searched for writing groups in English in Berlin. And I found the most amazing organization called the Reader Berlin. And that's where I restarted my fiction writing. So as a kid, it was all fiction. And then, like, my teens and early 20s and late 20s, it was all like opinion pieces, that kind of thing. Then in Berlin, it came back to fiction, and I was doing mostly short stories. And they were very, I would categorize them as maybe like a comedy horror. So when I wrote Sweetness in the Skin, it was a surprise to me what came out, because that isn't what I was really going for. I was trying to write something like super, I don't know, light and funny, and maybe throw some magical realism in there. But my character Pumpkin, she knew what she wanted, and she's
Yeah.
like, this is where the story is going. And I just had to do what she said. She's very strong-willed.
Wow, that's a lot. Like, okay, a lot of moving around and a lot of, I guess, like you've had writing in your life consistently, but I guess the way that you've been writing, what you've been writing, has changed.
Yeah.
So when it comes to writing, like whether you're writing like stories or you're writing about experiences and as an expat, what sort of things really matter to you in terms of what you want to bring out? And maybe like any values that you're driven by, or yeah, and what inspires you when it comes to writing.
I would say that when I was writing like opinion pieces and to just show people like what my experiences are and what life is like for a Jamaican wherever I am, just talking about things that everybody sees but and thinks it's funny. So I don't know if I was really thinking about bringing forth different types of values or feelings until I wrote Sweetness in the Skin.
Mm.
When I was writing this book, this is a very emotional book for me. It was for me to write, and I even some of the scenes I wrote, I would cry.
Mm.
And I've also heard from some readers that it's an emotional read as well, and it's really a departure from what I used to write before, because I was a person who I was very afraid of my own emotions, and I
Mm.
was not really taught to process my feelings and express my feelings and feel my feelings. I was taught to just laugh it off, push it aside, everything will be fine. And so this time when I was writing it, there were so many things that I wanted to talk about that really came out. So I left Jamaica. So I've been gone, I don't know, it's over 20 years for sure. When I left and I could look back with some distance and with some time, I saw a lot of things that began to bother me that didn't bother me
Mm.
when I was there. So a lot of that is like about the colorism and the
Mhm.
classism that we still experience there. When I was there, I was in a bubble, and
Mm.
this is just the way it is. This is just how life is. This is
Mm.
here. It's a small place. It's not going to change. But this is how things run. And especially if you benefit from those things, I think, at least for me, it wasn't really top of mind to like question why is it the way that it is. So once I left and I lived in much bigger cities where there was way more, I think I would call them more egalitarian societies, more so than Jamaica is very small, so the differences are very stark. That's when I started to contemplate or reflect on the just how different it is for different people and how much a disservice that is to us as a society, and also just how unfair it is. And And I used to talk about it a lot to people when they would ask me, "Oh, what's life like in Jamaica?" And the more I would talk about like my life, and I would say, "But there's also X, Y, Z," and I would just start to think like, why is it like that? Why do we accept it? And a lot of that came out in the story. I wanted to show I wanted to show what was for me a real Jamaica. So I think a lot of people have this idea of Jamaica as just sunny beach vacation. It's just a beach vacation, and they think we just lie on the beach all day, every day. And it is a great beach vacation. I would very much encourage everyone listening to go to Jamaica. It's a beautiful place. We have our own culture and ways of doing things and ways of speaking and things that we value and ways that we run and things that are good and things that are bad. And I just wanted to give people a flavor of of just everyday life, a normal life in Jamaica.
Mm. That's so fascinating. And like you do bring out a lot of, I think, some elements of Jamaican society and community that are not pleasant. You talk about class and colorism, and yeah, and I really enjoyed reading about those things because I think like those are things that a lot of us will have experience of no matter where we live. And it's interesting to see just the different ways that it comes out
Mhm.
and the way that it impacts our characters, because I do think you're right in that like sometimes when you're living in a place, especially I think when you're a bit younger, you're just like trying to get through, you're thinking about the trajectory of your life. You're not too bothered or like too fussed about things outside of yourself. And I think especially when you're younger, and also I think you things that are happening and you, like you said, you just accept it as this is just the way that things are, and you may not feel good about it, you may think that this isn't quite right, but I guess as well when you don't have like the words or the ideas to put to some of that stuff,
Exactly.
it's difficult. And I think what happens with space, but also with time and age and wisdom and life experience, we're able to understand. And I think there's something very healing and very therapeutic about that, to be able to look back at something and to be able to contextualize it and say, okay, this is what this was and this is what this experience was, and also like to be able to learn from that, I think, as well, and to carry that forward. You have spoken a little bit about your novel so far, but I wondered if you could just take a moment just to introduce Sweetness in the
Yes.
Skin.
Yes, I can. So, Sweetness in the Skin is a story about Pumpkin Patterson, who is basically trying to bake her way out of a bad situation and to a better life with her aunt in France. So, Pumpkin lives on the wrong side of the tracks with her mother, her aunt, and her grandmother, Cecile. And Cecile's two daughters, Paulette and Sophie. Sophie is light skinned, Paulette is dark skinned, and they have different fathers and therefore not therefore, but they have different fathers. And just because of the situation, they have different sort of trajectories in life. So the grandmother has really focused all of her attention on Sophie, who is lighter skinned and who has access to a bit more privilege, because she believes that Sophie is the one who will bring them out of their station and to a better station in life. And that causes, of course, a lot of resentment between Paulette and Sophie, but also between Paulette and her daughter Pumpkin. Pumpkin also comes out light skin because in Jamaica we like to say we mix up. Sometimes you don't know what's gonna come out. And so she looks more like Sophie, and they have a really close relationship, her and Sophie. So they have this idea that they're gonna go off to France. It's Sophie's big dream, and Pumpkin thinks it's her big dream as well. It's like when you dream of going to Mars. I don't know. You have this huge idea, but it's just so intangible.
Mm.
Then, through Sophie's work, she does get to go to France. She leaves Pumpkin behind, but says she's going to bring her in 1 year's time. But to do that, Pumpkin has to take this French exam, and it's very expensive, and there's no way to pay for it. So she finds this way of using her talent for baking to try and raise money. But does she succeed in the end? I don't know. You'll have to read it to see. But it's all about basically her struggles in trying to achieve this goal and get to her and in France. So that's the plot of the story. But like we mentioned before, it's really what it's really about is Pumpkin is looking for her place in the world. She's a young girl. She doesn't know where she belongs. Sophie's telling her she needs to be this sort of way in order to fit in with what Sophie believes is the right way. But then she has her mother and she has her other friends like Tamara who are saying, what's wrong with the way you are as you are? Why are you trying to hide yourself? Why are you trying to pretend like you're somebody else? Why are you trying to pass? You're trying to pass for uptown. And so she has this struggle and she's trying to figure out who she is really. And she feels very alone in this journey. And through it, though, she does find family. And it was really important for me to talk about this idea of found family and this
Mm.
idea of searching for identity. Because even though Pumpkin is this young girl from Jamaica, I think the theme is such a universal one. I think so many people are looking for who they are and where they fit and where they belong and what does family really mean. I think so many people are on a search for that. And so through this book, actually, I was also able to find a lot of healing myself and going through this kind of journey of, but what do I really believe and what do I want to think and what are my true values? I was able to work through that through Pumpkin.
Yeah. Pumpkin to me felt like my younger self or like my inner child.
Mhm,
And so I was really moved by some of what she went through and just her, as you said, like her trying to find her space in this world. But not just that, I think to feel loved and
mhm,
accepted for who she is,
yeah,
because I think for so long she didn't have that. And so she's a really great character. Like she's so lovely.
mhm.
Where did yeah, how did you come up with Pumpkin? Where did she come from? And yeah, I guess I'm assuming like some of it is your own, maybe like your thoughts about your own life or like your own experiences, what you've seen. But yeah, so like where did Pumpkin come from?
Yeah, she just popped up in my head. She really just appeared in my head. Her name is Pumpkin because my mom calls me Pumpkin.
Oh, okay.
And
That's sweet.
yeah, so it's not an autobiographical story,
Yeah.
but I have taken a lot of, I guess, my thoughts on things, some of my experiences that I've fictionalized and expanded, stuff from being in school, being in high school, and just taking like scenes from my life
Mm,
and then fictionalized them and expanded them in order to create a story that
mm,
you could tell. But yeah, there is a lot of me in Pumpkin. But she did. You said she felt like your inner child, and that's true. That's how she felt for me as well. Like she was my inner child. She was like knocking on the inside of my brain, let me out. So I just let her out. And honestly, like I would try each day. I would have this idea of where I wanted the story to go, and I would sit down, and then something else would come out. So after a while,
mm,
I just gave in, and I just said, I'm just gonna write whatever comes out and stop
yeah.
trying to force us in a different direction because she really had something to say.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you already mentioned that we've got really fraught relationships throughout the book. We've got this relationship between Pumpkin's mother and her sister Sophie,
Mhm,
and also between Pumpkin and her own mum.
mhm.
Now, for me, I think those are some of the hardest scenes to read
Yeah.
because their relationship is so bad. Like it's just there's just been this complete breakdown of their relationship, and it just feels like they never really had one to begin with. But it's really like in some ways it's very abusive. There's a lot of neglect. There's not like physical violence, but there is that sort of verbal unkindness. And really what we want for Pumpkin is to be like any child and to have just the warm embrace of her mother, but it doesn't happen. And we can see it's very clear throughout the book that her mum is dealing with a whole host of things herself, and she's dealing with like years of neglect herself from her own mother. And we know if we don't find the healing from those kind of traumas, they're passed down. It completely makes sense. And I think we get a real understanding of that really early on in the book. But what was really important for you when writing that mother-daughter relationship? What were you really interested in exploring?
Just exactly what you said, actually. Like, how far back does the trauma go is my interest. So I think sometimes you see these relationships. For example, I have a very close relationship with my mom, with both my parents. Me and my mom are super close. Sometimes I hear people talk about their relationship with their moms. I've had friends, for example, who talk about their relationships with their moms, and I cannot understand how it can be like that. It's difficult for me to understand how a mother can treat their child, a child that they carried within them and then went through the trauma of birthing. And then there's just this breakdown in a relationship or no relationship at all. And so I started to think about, like, why does that happen? And I believe it's because, just as you say, if you don't heal what has come from your parents or from whoever was your primary caregiver or whoever was in your life at those formative stages, then you internalize them. And I think you're not even aware of it. So in Paulette's case, she was never taught how to love. She was never taught how to have that kind of relationship. And I wanted to also use that as an example of this idea of this classism and this colorism and this sort of legacy of colonialism, because it is something that happens in the Caribbean, or at least in Jamaica as I know it, where you can have one family with kids of different shades, different hair textures, different eye colors, and simply because of that physical aspect, they are treated differently and are told that one has more worth than the other. And maybe one has more potential, one has more opportunities than the other in one family. And just something that I wanted to show as another example of how we have retained this idea from way back in the days when we were enslaved peoples, that this means more value and this means more worth. So I wanted to show how that can affect a relationship that is supposed to be such a beautiful relationship, supposed to be one of the strongest, if not the strongest relationships that there are, a mother and her daughter. And I felt bad for Paulette. I feel so much pity for Paulette because she's really an awful mother. But is she not a product of her environment? You could argue that there's always two ways to go. Some people who experience something bad say, I will never treat my kid like that, and they go in the opposite direction. But some people don't and can't. I feel like Paulette wanted to have that relationship with Pumpkin, and she just didn't know how. And that's why she became even more resentful, I think, of the relationship between Sophie and Pumpkin, because Sophie always gets everything that she wants, and now even her own daughter is closer to Pumpkin than she herself is. So that's one more thing that's in Sophie's favor. She's gotten everything, every opportunity in life. And here now, the one thing that Paulette has been able to create for herself, even that. And I think that's really sad.
Yeah, I also felt like deeply sorry for Paulette as a character. Also, I don't think it's justified to treat your child like that, regardless. But I really felt it. I really felt that she's just had an entire life where she's been treated as not good enough,
Mhm.
basically because of the color of her skin, because she's a darker shade than her sister is. And we see it, it's like blatantly obvious,
Mhm.
just the different opportunities that have come Sophie's way. And it's not just because those have come. Paulette has seen her mother make those things
Mhm.
possible.
Mhm.
And so I think she must feel this sense of like injustice, which isn't, because it's not just, oh, this is the way the world works.
Right.
As a child, you're like, this is what my mother is making possible. And I think that's so heavy to carry. And I also, one of the reasons why I feel bad for Paulette is because it never stopped for her.
Mhm.
It never stopped, because also Sophie was always there.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, had Sophie moved away before Pumpkin was born, and had Paulette just been raising Pumpkin by herself, still living with her mother or wherever, but if Sophie wasn't in the picture, do you think that Paulette may have been different in how she raised her daughter?
I can't imagine that she would be. I can't imagine because I think it would have depended on when Sophie would have left. Because, like I said, I think the formative years are really when everything gets cemented. I think that's what they say. I don't know, scientifically or whatever. That the first 7 years are like everything just gets set. And I think if she grew up in that space with Sophie, even if Sophie had left just before, she would still have had so much resentment towards her mother. I think there's an alternate world where perhaps if Sophie was not there and she had Pumpkin, and I don't know. I don't know. I've never thought of it. I can't imagine it, but you never really know, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah, because I wonder, in the way that you were saying, like when you left Jamaica, that was when you started to look at things a little bit differently. I wonder if Paulette had just had some space, if that would have just enabled her to heal a little bit. And because there is something about, if something is constantly in your face, it's
Yeah.
like constantly happening to you every single day, every interaction is about this thing, you can't escape it. And I feel like that builds resentment continually. So it's just obviously, like, I was just thinking when I was reading that, I wonder, like, if Sophie hadn't been there, would she have been forced to, because Sophie has done so much for Pumpkin her entire life, would Paulette would have had to step up, because she'd have had the screaming baby to look after, and then this like toddler and child running around. Obviously, like, this is just, we can't say for sure, because I get the sense from you as well that you developed the character of Pumpkin, but Pumpkin became her own person.
Oh yeah, definitely. Paulette had Pumpkin when she was like 15 or 16.
Mm,
Even with when we talk about distance and time, I think a lot of that comes in your like 30s and 40s. So I think by that time it might have been too late.
mm,
Not that people don't have these epiphanies beforehand. She would have still been in a bad situation. She would have still not had that love and effort poured into her by her own mother. So again, I don't know if she could have been a better mother without Sophie there, because who
mm.
knows if Cecile, the grandmother, had only had her. Who knows? We'll never
Yeah,
know.
exactly.
Write a different book.
Right. I know, a different reality,
Yeah.
a different version of Pumpkin's life. But I really enjoyed reading about the relationship between Pumpkin and Sophie.
Mm.
We had this very beautiful aunt niece relationship, which I think is one of the best relationships in the world. And we don't, like, especially in terms of literature, it's not really there. There's a lot of focus on mother-daughter relationships. What were you really hoping to bring out about that special aunt-niece relationship?
I don't think I even actually really set out to highlight it specifically. I just wanted someone in her life who was her advocate. It just seemed natural to me to make it an aunt. On the one hand, as well, I wanted to highlight this idea of the friction between family members in one space. And I always think, I'm an only child, so I don't know for sure, but from what things that I read and things that I hear from friends, like relationships between sisters can be fraught, even when they
Mhm.
are a strong bond and amazing. There can be a lot of fighting and resentment and happy times and awful times. And I just think as an only child, it's interesting, this idea. And yeah, I just wanted somebody in her life to who was really pouring themselves into her and pouring love into her and time and effort, and just seemed natural for that to be an aunt.
Yeah. As I said, I really enjoyed reading about it, but it also added confusion to Pumpkin
Mm,
because Sophie had such a clear vision for the life that she wanted to lead, where she wanted to be, how she was going to get there. And I think what comes with that is the different class elements. And so there's the scene where Pumpkin's been invited to a, a, a party or a sleepover
yeah.
with Mandy, and she doesn't really want to go. She has the vibe that like we're not really going to be friends, like we're not really, I don't really, and she'd rather go and hang out with Tamara. But she knows, and she says, "Oh, if Sophie finds out I was invited and I didn't go, she's going to be really upset."
Mhm.
And I think that's a lot to carry for a child. And so I think, like Sophie was so definitely so loving, but at the same time, she also had these expectations
Yeah.
of Pumpkin. And what do you think that kind of did to her?
Confusion is the right word. I think that so many parents and parental figures have these expectations for their kids, right? And they have their own values and they have their own ideas of what they want their kids to be and to achieve. Pumpkin is essentially Sophie's kid, let's just say, because she might not have birthed her, but Sophie certainly was the one raising her. I think sometimes that when I think parents can so often be blind to what their own kids want to achieve or want to do or who they are actually as people, and instead just want to imprint their own idea of the kind of child they want to have is the kind of child that you should be, as opposed to just letting you discover yourself. And what that does, I believe, is to sometimes it makes people lose focus or not even begin to think about who they could be or who they really are or what they actually want or what they actually like. Because you have these people who you think your parents are like superheroes to you. If you have a good relationship with them, your parents are like superheroes to you sometimes, or like gods to you or something when you're a little kid.
Mm,
And they have this idea, this is what you're going to do, this is what you're going to be, even if they don't say specifically you're going to be a pilot, but it's just in the way that they, in the way that they're raising you, they're showing you, they're saying what they want from you. And I think sometimes kids will contort themselves to fit this ideal, and sometimes it can make you lose your own sense of self or not develop your own sense of self. And that's what Pumpkin is struggling with, or was struggling with. She knows that this is what Sophie wants, so that's the right thing, right? Because Sophie wants it, and Sophie's her aunt. Sophie is like her mother, so that should be
mm,
the right thing, right? But then something in her is saying it doesn't feel right.
mm,
And if you don't learn to trust your own feelings and your own intuition, then you never really know yourself and never really know what you want. And then you end up, I don't know, people pleasing, chasing the wrong things, unhappy, discontent. That's what I believe. And Pumpkin was really trying to figure out where does she belong, like we said at the beginning. And just as you said before about having space, I think it was a good thing that Sophie went before
mm,
her, because as you said, like when something is just in your face, you cannot process it. So when Sophie left and said, okay, I'm going to bring you over in 1 year's time, she had that time, even as she's desperately trying to get to Sophie, she had that time to other friendships, to develop her little baking business. She's basically like an entrepreneur, which I tell a lot of Jamaican kids are making little things and selling them at school undercover and that kind of thing. And she's figuring it out. She's figuring out to trust herself a little bit more. And I am really glad that I made pumpkin so young because I really love the idea of a young woman, a young girl coming into her own at an earlier age. I feel like all this kind of contemplation and reflection of identity and who I want to be, that came from me like in my 30s, in my 40s. And I just think if girls came into their own a little bit earlier, how powerful would we be if we had that strong sense of self?
Mhm.
Even though you need the maturity, you need that kind of experiences for sure. But if you started out even stronger, I just think that would be so cool. So
Yeah.
yeah, this is what Pumpkin is battling with.
Yeah. I love the fact that Pumpkin was so just like focused. And I don't just mean in terms of Paris, but like she wasn't distracted. And I think like with older girls and like older characters in books as well, when they start like having an interest in boys or dating, or and then there's like politics among friendship groups, like we didn't have any of that, and it was so nice because it I think it was so clear,
Mhm.
and it was so good to be able to see Pumpkin just think about things in and of themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, do I want to go to this party? Yes or no? Because do I want to be here?
Mhm.
Not, oh, there's going to be X, Y, and Z boy there, and da, da, da. It wasn't there, but that noise wasn't there in the same way for her at all.
Yeah.
It was just really nice to read, and I think it is important as well because, as you said, if we are thinking more about ourselves and like what we want to do and where we want to be when we're younger, I can't imagine like how much that would just fuel us and empower us to
Mhm.
make the right decisions for ourselves later on as well, especially when we're in a position to be more independent and we're not relying on others. Not that Pumpkin was relying on people at all, really. But you talk about colorism throughout the book, but you also talk about class. And we see that a lot come out with Pumpkin and her friends at school. And when she has Mandy, who is from a more affluent background, comes and she's like really freaked out and she really struggles
Mhm.
to accept Pumpkin's reality, and Pumpkin knew as well. She knew that this was going to be a thing. What are some of the things about class in Jamaica that you're interested in, and what are some of the reflections that you have that you wanted to bring out in the book?
I think it's this idea of just how critical it is for your development, for your ability to move forward, for your ability to succeed. That's what interests me the most. Like the idea that the structure is so rigid. I've always found, again, this is my experience from being in Jamaica, is you can't really cross the class lines.
Mm.
Someone, how in America, if you make a lot of money, like that's it. You're in, like, you're rich now and people have a new respect for you and that kind of thing. In Jamaica, I found even if you, let's say, came into great wealth or success, but if you weren't from the right background, if you didn't speak with the right accent, if you accidentally dropped an H or added one where it shouldn't be, people would be like, yeah. No, that was how I found it. That it was this very rigid structure. And it's just a matter of luck that you end up being born in a certain socioeconomic background or with a certain last name.
Mm.
Last names are very important, I found. In Jamaica, you have these brand name last names that really mean something. And I remember growing up there as well. It was like, it's just so important. Who do you know? And what is your connection to so and so? And people would use that at the beginning of a conversation if they didn't already know you, because it's very hard to like not know people in Kingston because it's so small. But people always want to make sure they know who you're connected to because they want to see if you're worth their time.
Mm.
And I found that infuriating. Like I remember going to a friend's party once, and it was like a family, like a Christmas thing, and he introduced me to his, I don't know, like a family friend, an older person. And she's like, which Robinson are you? Which Robinson? And she needs to know, who is my dad? And like, because she needs to figure out if my dad is somebody, is he somebody? And am I worth her time? And it bothered me so much. Then you had people who, like I said, you had these like brand name last names that they don't have to worry about that
Mm.
because it's clear. And so when there's this scene where Pumpkin is talking to Sophie and she's saying, these girls at school, these uptown girls, they speak patois. Why do I always have to speak the Queen's English when they're dropping into dialect? And Sophie's, because they're beyond reproach. Nobody's thinking that they might be quote unquote low class. But
Mm.
we are passing. We have to keep it up. So these are the things that interested me about the class system in Jamaica, and also just infuriated me
Mm.
as well, because it almost felt like to me like your place was precarious in a way if you didn't make those right connections or do the same things that everybody in that social class was doing, drove a certain kind of car. Or and again, it's not to say like every single person really is participating in like a serious way, but in general, that's how I found it, and I found it exhausting. And when I left, for example, here in Berlin, nobody cares what you're doing. Nobody cares what you're up to. Nobody cares if you have money, if you don't have money. You can't even tell. And for me, that's just freeing, because then it frees you up to just, people just accept you for you and not for who you might know or who you might be connected to. And it just feels, oh, I can breathe. That's what I wanted. That's what interests me. That's what interests me most about classism in Jamaica. And that's what I wanted to present.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I think if I think about the UK, my idea of the US is that class is a little bit more fluid as well. And I've never lived there, so I can't say, but in the UK, I feel like the higher up you go in terms of class or wealth or status, whatever the right word is,
Mm.
I feel like there becomes an obsession with what school did you go to? What university did you go to? What do your parents do?
Mm.
What university did they go to? Or did all this kind of stuff. But I feel like it matters like the higher up you go. And as you try and infiltrate different groups or be accepted
Mm.
into different groups,
Yeah.
those things matter
Yeah.
increasingly. And I see that's a lot, because if you have a look at like the UK government, for example, most of the MPs have been educated at Eton. Most of them are Oxbridge graduates. We know that like you have to be from that ilk to not only get into that, but to get into that and then succeed. I don't think we would ever have a prime minister in this country, or it'd be very difficult for us to have a prime minister in this country, even if they're from like a left wing party
Mm.
who is not from that world.
Yeah.
I think it'll be very difficult. And I hope, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And yeah, and I feel like it is the higher up you go, and it really matters. And the thing is, you can be doing all the right things, but they can pick up on one thing, or you don't speak
Exactly.
right. And we have this in the UK, like this like north south divide in terms of one's accent. And I always feel like I have a very southern accent. But that's just because I was born in London
Yeah.
and I was raised in London. If I was born 2 hours north,
Yeah.
if I lived in Birmingham or I lived in Bradford, my accent would be very different. And I know that that impacts a lot of things. It's just like a bizarre thing that you can't really control how you speak or the dialect that it just depends on where you're born with. So I find it so interesting. And I do wonder also if, because the UK has had previously, like historically, a very rigid class structure, like very rigid,
Mhm.
and I think it's only changing somewhat now. But I think the top is always going to stay the way that it is. And I wonder also, like, whether this is also, like another remnant of colonialism around the world, because I know, like, a lot of communities, like, there always is this, like, tribalism and caste and colorism and things. But I wonder if this also has made an impact
A
on
hundred,
class structures. Hmm.
100%. That is 100% where I think it comes from. I think we
Mm.
have just we have taken it because that was what, like you said yourself, they had a rigid class structure, and then you have people from a certain class who came to Jamaica
Mm.
and then had the plantations, and they just transferred that way of thinking, that way of life onto us. Then they created the class structures there as well. If you are owning and running a plantation, and you're good. If
Mm.
you're one of those people who are forced to work in the field, in the hot sun, um, in horrible conditions, then you're the worst off. If you're one of those people who got to work in the house and where it's cool, and maybe do different things that are not so backbreaking, and you get a little bit more privilege, then you're better off than the ones who are working outside. And so you have this structure where, just like literally, you are better off than the person below you. And then I believe when slavery ended, was abolished, and we then moved slowly into, a normal society where everyone worked, and everyone was free. We just maintained that structure.
Mm.
So I remember when I was a kid, they had this little thing they used to say: if you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, get back. I
Oh,
don't
wow.
know if it was a song or what I used to hear when I was
Oh my
a kid.
gosh.
And it was just that same structure. I am better off than you because I'm up here. And
Mm.
then in the middle, I am better off than you because you're down there. Somebody always needs to feel better off. And I think that it then became, first it was like really a physical thing, and then it just became a mental thing.
Mm.
I've been saying this in every interview, but Bob Marley keeps saying, he was singing about emancipate yourself from mental slavery. This is what he's talking about. So it feels like in our heads, we're just still maintaining this system from when we were enslaved. So I 100% think that the class structure from our colonizers were imprinted in us and in who we are. And I hope that it is changing. I've been gone a long time, like I said, and I feel like a lot of things are changing in Jamaica. It's very slow to change because it's a very small place
Mm.
in the middle of the sea. But I think a lot of things have been changing for the better. And I hope that this is one of them. I think part of it is education and learning to love ourselves in our entirety. A lot of that has to do with our hair, wearing your hair naturally. It has to do with loving our skin, deep mahogany skin, brown skin, whatever it is, and appreciating who we are. I think that's coming about slowly. And I hope that there will be a day when this class structure just doesn't exist in the same way that it does now or did then. Yeah, one can hope. Maybe when you have a prime minister from a rootsy prime minister, then the same.
Yeah, because obviously there is an intersection and impacts of race and skin color with class, but I honestly believe that in all structures around the world, class trumps everything.
Oh yeah.
Because in the UK, we have a brown prime minister. He's of Indian heritage. India is a former colonized country. It blows my mind when I think about it. But because of his class, that trumps all of it. He does not represent minority communities in the UK. None of his policies are supportive of black and brown communities in the UK or around the world. Like, and it just shows you that actually class seems to trump all of that. And it can really skew, I think, as well, your perception of yourself
Mm,
and your perception of your roots if you're so entrenched in a class, in a society that is hell bent on having things a certain way and having certain communities rule over or control others. Yeah, and I hope, I am too hopeful that that it does change. And obviously, like, I think there is some difference. I think around the world we are seeing this like growing quote unquote like middle class, or this where like people have more of a disposable income, people have more autonomy over what they're doing, people are traveling more, people, all this kind of stuff. Like, this is definitely changing, but yeah, I think the problem is that like when power lies still at the top and the top is full of people from a certain class and a certain background, that I think, because that impacts everything. It doesn't matter if people are able to travel the world, if the cost of bread is determined by something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just bizarre. It perpetuates the problems of inequality within any country. Like, the UK, like the reliance on food banks has increased manyfold, and like people are really struggling just to pay their bills and to get by, and it just, yeah, it's a sorry state of affairs. As you said, like, we are hopeful. I think change is going to come in different ways and on many different fronts, and I think supporting each other and like building and keeping community, I think it really makes such a big difference. When it comes to sweetness in the skin, what do you hope for anyone that picks up the book? What do you hope they take away from it?
I want this book to be like a trip to Jamaica, to 90s Jamaica, best Jamaica. Because as much as we have spoken about a lot of the issues from that time, I loved growing up in Jamaica. It was such an amazing childhood. It is such an amazing place. And I actually, Pumpkin came into my head, but when I started writing, it was from this place of deep homesickness. I just
Oh,
wanted to go home, and go home in the sense of back to my youth, because I would go home and visit, and somehow it wouldn't quench that thirst, because it was about going back to this time when our responsibility was different, and there was sunshine every single day. There was
mm,
warmth every day. The smell of Jamaica, the food, like the that feeling. There was these. I would remember like the smell after a rain, or I would be listening to. I would hear a certain song, like anything by Third World, for example, and I'd start to cry, because
yeah.
it just reminded me so much of home, and I wanted to go back there. And so it's a beautiful place. It was an amazing place to grow up. And I want, when people pick up the book, that they feel like they're on a trip to Jamaica, that they're seeing my Jamaica, that they can see it, that they can feel it, that they can taste it. I want them to get a glimpse into a little bit of what life was like. I want them to definitely experience the way that we communicate. It was very important for me to include some patois in the book. I tried to do it so that I would use some patois, like you would be able to understand from what everybody else was saying what was just said. But it was important for me, even for people who spoke standard English, we still manipulate the words in a different way. So it was
Yeah.
very important for me to include that. And so I hope they just get a taste, a feeling of what it's like to be Jamaican and to have an amazing trip.
I loved all the descriptions of places, of sounds, of food, and obviously, like, Pumpkin is a baker.
Mhm.
And just actually, as we wrap up, because I know we've been talking for a long time, why did you decide to have Pumpkin as a baker? I loved it. I loved reading the different things that she was making, and just like the smell,
Mm.
and yeah, like it like oozed off the page. But yeah, why did you decide to have food such a big part of her life?
Yeah. Food is such a strong connection to home. When you think of your youth, I feel like a lot of people will remember, oh, that thing that my grandma used to make, that cake. Oh my gosh, you would kill to get it again. It's gone
Yeah.
forever. Or something your dad used to cook, or your mom used to cook, or whoever. It's just something you can taste a thing sometime, and it will bring you right back to a certain place. Or you taste something and you're like, this isn't right because my aunt used to do it this way. Baking was for Pumpkin an escape. in two different ways. One, she was trying to use it as a literal escape from her house to go to her aunt. It was a means by which she could raise some money to see if she could make it to Auntie Sophie. But also, we spoke about the fact she's from a very dysfunctional family. And sometimes when things just got tense and horrible, to go into the kitchen and focus on creating something it was her safe space. So it would take her out of whatever was going on in the house. And I use baking specifically because baking is so precise. You can't, if you're cooking, I prefer to cook actually. I don't bake. I prefer to cook. And with cooking, you don't even have to think sometimes. You can just throw this in, throw that in. You don't really have to, you can just wing it.
Yeah.
Baking, if it says 1 cup, you need 1 level cup. You can't just wing it. And so if you're focusing on measuring and blending and mixing and doing this at this specific time, I think it's a really great way to block out a lot of noise. So that's why I made her a baker. For that means of escape. And also, just logistically, it is easier to bring sweet treats to school and sell them as it is to, I don't know, you can't bring box lunch to school. You can't bring packets of chicken and rice. So baking is just easier.
Yeah, no, I absolutely loved it. Yeah, like I said, like I loved all the description of everything that she made. And also like it was just so obvious that she loved it, like she loved doing it. And yeah, it's so lovely. Ishi, thank you so much for your time today. It has been so wonderful speaking to you. I'm sure Pumpkin is going to be loved by every single person that picks up your book. She's going to be touching hearts all over the place. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.